All right, we come to section. All right, we come to section 10 at this point, and Mark, this is the disclosures section of the real estate contract. What do we need to know about this?
So in Florida, there are certain required disclosures, obviously, and the contract's going to have most of them in there. I think the only one that's not going to be in here, well, it's actually at the very end. So if you're new at real estate and you're curious, does my seller have to disclose? Well, here's a good section to review to know which categories are required. So we'll go through them.
Let's run through those.
Yep. So we got rate on gas. Now, in Florida, we don't really have rate on gas. I think maybe at some point in the past, somebody has found some radon gas. So there's a required disclosure, but ultimately radon comes from limestone. And since our properties are mostly built on sand and water, not a big concern. People from the north may be concerned about it and tell you all sorts of stories about how they had to get a radon inspection.
Detector and
Yep. So not a big issue in North Florida. Permit disclosures. So again, this is going back to where if the buyer has elected to get some sort of municipal lien search, it may pull up expired or non-closed out or open permits. So again, this is going to talk about under the Florida statute, seller is supposed to identify any permits that have not been closed out for improvements. Most of the time, the sellers will be like, I don't know. We had somebody work on it. I have no idea what they did or didn't do. But just know that in the contract, there is a requirement for the seller to disclose. But a lot of times they're going to say, I didn't have any personal knowledge what the contractor did or did not do. So the safest thing for a buyer, just get your municipal lien search.
There we go. So we come to mold.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is we're dealing with the FAR/BAR contract here. If you pull out the CRISP, there isn't a single mention of the word mold in a CRISP contract.
Gotcha.
So what that means, let's say you do a WDO inspection, your wood destroying organism, and the inspector on the WDO is not allowed to say, hey, you have mold, I would recommend go getting a mold inspection. All they're allowed to do is say there is some suspicious stuff in the roof, and you need to have that checked out.
Yeah.
So for some reason, Florida has separated out the two, where a WDO person cannot advise of mold or anything. But be aware of which contract you're using, because like I said, on the CRISP contract, let's assume you have all your inspection periods. There is no default saying, well, if you find suspicious, you now have additional time to go get a mold inspection.
Yeah.
Something they need to deal with. But at least here, it's just going to explain that mold is naturally occurring. If the buyer is concerned, there is a rider involved with the FAR/BAR that you can add. So,
But it's on the buyer to have that inspected. It's on the seller to disclose it if they know of it. But other than that, this is disclosing, hey, buyer, you need to check this out if it's of concern to you, right?
Yep.
All right. Flood zone, elevation certificate.
Yeah, so in our area where you're probably doing most of your real estate sales, flood zones are going to be a huge topic.
Yeah.
Because right now in 2023, the price of flood insurance is, no pun intended, through the roof. So to know whether or not a property is in a special flood hazard area or not is an important thing for the buyer. Now, understand another thing. Sellers probably don't comb through the public records to verify whether FEMA has revised the flood maps. So the only way a seller knows for certain whether they're in a flood zone is because their existing insurance company has run an update on the FEMA maps and said, you're now in a flood zone, you are required to have flood insurance.
Gotcha.
So you can't completely rely on a seller disclosing whether they are or are not in a flood zone. So there are addendums also that you can attach to the contract that says in the event it is in a flood zone, buyer has a right to cancel if flood insurance is more than X amount of dollars.
Gotcha.
So for instance, in our area, Kelly Plantation, Regatta Bay, some of the homes are in a flood zone and some of them are not in the flood zone. So as you're going through the different areas that we have here in Northwest Florida, be aware of where the flood zone lines are. And if you know you're dealing with a property close to those, maybe add an addendum which allows the buyer to verify first while you're going through that.
Gotcha. And I notice on line 242, there's an asterisk there. So if left blank, they have 20 days to basically go through this. It says buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice to seller within 20 days after the effective date, and they will be refunded their deposit, releasing buyer and seller from all further obligations under this contract. Failing, the buyer accepts existing elevation of buildings in flood zone designation of the property. Actually, we need to go up a little bit higher in that the beginning of the sentence says, if the property is in a special flood hazard area or Coastal Barrier Resources Act designated, and the lowest floor elevation for the buildings or flood insurance rating is below minimum flood elevation or is ineligible for flood insurance coverage through the National Flood Insurance Program, then they may terminate. So it's basically, if they can't get it insured.
Correct.
All right.
This has to do with insurability. The other one has to do with whether or not the price, because most of the time you're dealing with a buyer who's running the numbers right to the penny.
Yeah.
And then flood insurance comes in $4,000 instead of $850, and they're like, oh, I can't afford that. Plus, their lender's going to escrow more money at closing, those kind of things.
Perfect. All right. Energy brochure.
You're never going to have to deal with this, so I wouldn't even worry about it, but just know that there's a Florida statute that says buyers acknowledge receipt of Florida energy efficiency rating information brochures, which likely lenders are probably handing those to you.
Yeah, and we do send them to, when we're sending over the buyer contract, we send that to them just so it's a disclosure.
Yeah.
Lead-based paint.
So any house that was done prior to 1978, if there's a possibility, could have used lead-based paint. They're worried about, I guess, either you or your kids chewing on walls and eating the lead-based paint. So if the house is pre-1978, there's a required disclosure.
Yep, and that's in, you'll find that in DocuSign to be able to send that out. Homeowners Association community disclosure. All right.
Yeah, so we all know there's a whole separate addendum that must be attached if you're buying a property that has a mandatory homeowners association. Like in Blue Water Bay, there's a subdivision called Raintree, and even though they have an association, it's not mandatory.
Gotcha.
So it's only if it's a mandatory association, but there also has to be a disclosure attached that tells you how much the association dues are. They paid monthly, quarterly, so be aware of that.
And notice, agent, it says buyer should not execute this contract until the buyer has received and read the homeowners association disclosure, if applicable.
Right.
So that's on you to gather that information to present or provide to the buyer if you're representing the buyer, so that they can do that. And if you're representing the seller, it's not a bad practice to go ahead and pull that information and make it easy for them to bring you an offer. Okay?
Yeah, the thing and the best way, so here's where it gets a little tricky with that. So the seller could post something on the MLS that says, here's our latest and greatest information. They may, let's say it's not a seller's market. Properties have been sitting there now for 6 months, 8 months, and the association has come through and done some sort of amendment to the dues. So from the listing standpoint, if you are going to publish that information, maybe in the document section of the MLS, you're going to have to periodically make sure you contact the association to get the updated information. From the buyer's standpoint, since you're not what we call a member or an owner of property there, I'm pretty sure you cannot call the association and say, tell me how much your dues are in this. They may disclose the information, but they're not required to,
right,
because you're not a member.
Yeah, so that's where you would go through the seller and the listing agent through the seller, through the listing agent, for them to be able to provide that. All right, property tax disclosure summary.
So essentially, there's going to likely be in the MLS, last year's taxes were X amount of dollars. This is just a notice, and you can tell in the disclosures, everything seems to be in bold, because now disclosures, they think everything's important. But a buyer coming in cannot rely on how much the taxes were last year to budget or predict how much they're going to be this year.
Yeah.
And a couple clear examples. We did a closing one time. Seller, Gulfront property, had lived in the property since 1979. So they got the homestead protection. It could only increase 3% per year. So taxes went from like $1,800 to almost $30,000. not going to happen on a normal closing most of the time.
Yeah.
But again, the purpose of this is one of the items you just want to double check. Does the seller have, maybe they're 100% disabled and their tax bill is zero?
Yeah.
And the buyer comes in not knowing how much. You can always call the tax collector's office and say, what would projected taxes be next year if the disability goes away and my clients purchase it? So they're always available for that.
Yeah. And basically, this is just disclosing in this contract, hey, just because it was that way this last year doesn't mean it will be that way after the property transfers. FIRPTA, Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act.
So this is going to cover a seller who does not file taxes here in the U.S. Obviously, our government wants every penny they can get.
Mm-hmm.
If a foreign seller sells property in, let's just say, Florida, and the government has no way to get their taxes out of it if there's capital gains, FIRPTA is going to come to play. So what's going to happen is when it's under contract and you give it to the closing company, like me, first thing we do is we send a seller information sheet to the seller, and we ask these kind of questions to the seller. So we sort of know in advance whether or not they're considered foreign. Now, just because they live in Canada does not necessarily mean they're subject to FIRPTA. And for your purposes, you don't need to be an expert in what FIRPTA is or when it applies. Just be aware, if you're representing a seller, you may want to ask them, do you file taxes in the U.S.? If you're representing a buyer and you see some strange name come across as the seller, you may want to inquire with the listing agent, are they subject to FIRPTA? And the reason we bring that up is because the way the government takes this, if the seller was supposed to be applicable to FIRPTA and the closing company and the parties miss it, the government gets a lien against the property.
Yeah.
So really the government looks to the buyer as the one who's going to make sure whether FIRPTA applies or not. Now, you have a 78-year-old lady who has no idea of any of this stuff. Clearly, they don't know anything about FIRPTA. So, a couple red flags. Just look for those. Ask the questions. Move on.
There we go. Seller disclosure. So, I think that's where we are. Yeah, coming to the end.
So, this is the big one for Florida. You always hear of buyer beware or caveat emptor. Well, this is caveat emptor except seller disclosure. So really a seller has an affirmative duty, and I'll read it because it's very specific language. Seller knows of no facts materially affecting. So we've only hit 6 words, and seller knows. They're always going to allege, I have no personal knowledge, I didn't know that. Of no facts material, they'll say, I don't know what material is or not material.
Right.
Affecting the value, well, how much is that? Is that $1,000? Is that $500? Is it $50,000? Nobody really knows.
Yeah.
Of the real property, which are not readily observable. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Should an inspector have found it or not found it? Did they hire an inspector or not hire an inspector? And if had they hired an inspector, would it have been readily observable? And which have not been disclosed to buyer. So I call that, this is why we have attorneys and this is why we have judges, because I could not sit here and outline exactly black and white what that encompasses.
Right.
I normally tell agents, if you are unsure, disclose, disclose, disclose. In the real world, though, the seller's like, I don't know. Why is there fresh paint on the garage ceiling? I don't know. Because I'm covering up mold or something that was there. Something like that, where a seller has done something like that, clearly that's going to fall in there. So.
All right. So those are the disclosures for Section 10 of the FAR Bar contracts. Be aware of it, read over it, understand it. Generally speaking, these are not things that you'll be focused on, and rarely do they come up in conversations. But you need to know.
Yeah, and the other thing is, you're not an attorney. You're not an attorney. You're not an attorney. Be aware of the provisions that exist. And when you get specific questions, unfortunately, all you have to say is, I am not an attorney. I'm not authorized to answer that question. I recommend you go hire an attorney to answer your questions.
There you go. All right. We'll be back with Section 11.